God. They're under the king Ahab and the evil Queen Jezebel. And, of course, they're worshiping idols of Baal and others. And Elijah is sent to these people to try to rescue them or turn their hearts back to God. And, of course, he's had some success in that. He's challenged Ahab and the priests of Baal. And they went up on Mount Carmel, and they were to light the fire by calling on their gods. And then Elijah would light the fire by having God do that. And in that contest between those two, of course, the false prophets could not light that fire, but Elijah did, and the people saw that and the mighty works of God. And yet they did not turn. And we see Elijah now having run because Jezebel put a bounty on his head, and she killed the prophets of the Lord. And even the people turned against Elijah, and he ran in fear and hid in his cave. And then, of course, we see in Matthew the disciples, the fact that they're on this boat in the wind and the waves, and then Jesus comes to them walking on water. And, of course, they were afraid. So, indeed, we see some changes here today. So as I bring this message, let's think about what God has to hear for us here today. I don't really need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. We're in one of the worst pandemics the world has ever seen. People are afraid to leave their homes. They're afraid to travel on cars or boats or planes. They're afraid to visit their neighbors, their relatives, or even their children. There are no birthdays, no weddings, no funerals. We're afraid to attend school. People are afraid of each other, afraid of the police, afraid of certain things in the world, afraid to talk about certain things to their family or their friends, and certainly they don't mention them to strangers. We're afraid to breathe the air and afraid even to go to church. Now, I'm not talking about COVID-19. Now, that disease certainly has set off the consequences that we see here today, but that's not the essential problem. The pandemic I'm speaking of here is the pandemic of fear. The pandemic of our time is fear itself. Fear is nothing that's made of virus or bacteria. It's not a vapor or a molecule. No, nothing so simple that we can test it in a test tube or mark it with a DNA marker or see it in a microscope. Fear is brought forth in the darkness of our minds and has profound and lasting effects on our being and even our very lives. Fear causes our hearts to beat wildly, our palms to sweat. And if you want to see sweaty palms, I got some right up here to observe here. It increases the adrenaline in our body. It makes our thoughts race. Fear can change your life. It can make you sick. It can blind your senses. And yes, indeed, fear can kill. In World War II, at the Battle of Arnhem, Holland, paratroopers were dropped behind German lines. During that battle, they became trapped up against the Rhine River with little or no ammunition, with no way to stop armored vehicles. 75-ton German tanks assaulted them day and night. During the battle, a young soldier was brought into an aid station, trembling in fear and screaming for all his life. But upon examination, the doctors could not find a single scratch on him. There was no apparent injury to this soldier. So they took him, put him in a hallway in this little house that had turned into an aid station amidst the bombs and the bullets splattering against the wall. And as he lay there, he turned to the soldier who was wounded beside him. He said, "I just can't take it. I'm just so scared." A few minutes passed, and the trembling soldier stopped his trembling and fell silent. When aides came to check on him, they found him dead. He had died literally of fear, scared to death. We are here in this time are not the only ones to succumb to fear. In these three scripture readings, we see that falling victim to fear is as old as mankind itself. Elijah fell victim to his fear. That seems surprising to me. Maybe it does to you. I mean, here was a man of God. He knew God. He had called on God's power to light that fire, a fire that burned that offering and even burned the water that had been poured over that offering. He had seen God wipe away those false prophets of Baal and put them to the sword. He had seen God's power. And yet when Jezebel put that bounty on his head and sent her soldiers off to kill him, he fled in fear. Now, I don't think Elijah really was afraid of Jezebel. I don't think he was really afraid of the soldiers she sent to kill him. I think what Elijah was really afraid of was that he had failed. Elijah had come to turn the hearts of the people of Israel back to God. Yet even in this demonstration that should have woken them to the truth of God's power, why they refused to listen. You know, that's the funny thing sometimes about truth. It hurts. And sometimes when it hurts, we refuse to accept it. And that's what had happened to the people of Israel. They refused to accept the truth of God. They turned against Elijah and the prophets of God. They killed them. They helped the soldiers pursue Elijah into the desert. No, Elijah wasn't afraid of soldiers or kings. He was afraid of his failure, of what God would do to a people who refused to return to God, and so he hid. He hid out of fear in a cave. He feared the outcome of what God could do. You know, at least Elijah's fear was real. In the case of the disciples, their fear was entirely imagined. And yet, more than Elijah, we can understand their circumstances. They are in a small boat in the middle of a lake. Even today, the Sea of Galilee can have sudden storms that come up that can sink even the most modern vessel built. The wind and waves were against them, as it says in the scriptures. The boat was tossed. They were bailing for all they were worth. They were concerned about their lives because if that boat sank, they had a 100% chance of dying. And then, out of nowhere, comes this apparition. Yes, we can probably understand their sudden fear that this is a ghost. When life storms are raging against us, when we have no other way to turn, sometimes we cling to myths or even imagine ghosts where none exist. When black children are dying all around us and the truth is hard to accept, it's easy to imagine ghosts of police officers who we think are the problem. Joseph's brothers also had imaginary fears. I think that most think that they acted to kill Joseph or at least sell him into slavery because of their anger and jealousy. And I'm not so sure about that. You know, some of us had arrogant. You know, Joseph was arrogant. He was self-centered. He was a brat. He lorded over his father's favorite over his brothers. But many of us have had arrogant, self-centered siblings in our family, and we didn't seek to put them to death. You know, I think the reason that the brothers agreed to sell Joseph was that they feared him. They knew the story of Jacob and his their uncle. They knew what had happened in that case. They had heard Joseph tell them about the dreams where he had been the wheat sheaf that stood up and they were the wheat sheaves that bowed down. They were afraid that Jacob would give Joseph the birthright and that they would end up as vassals to this self-arrogant brat of a brother. They were afraid of what Joseph would become. Funny thing, though, little did they know that in selling him into slavery, they would make Joseph become the very thing that they feared. Of course, that's a story for another day. But take a look. That is often the case with our imagined fears. The things that we do bring about the fears that we have. So how do we overcome fear? How do we overcome the fears in our life? You know, we could be assured that COVID-19 will be overcome. There will be a vaccine. Humankind will develop immunity. We have before. The Spanish flu the Black Plague, polio. We can name many, many, many diseases over the years that are now little more than a memory. And COVID will go the same way. But through the ages, mankind has not cured fear. There is no vaccine or psychotherapy that will cure fear. There's no self-help books or herbal remedies that will cure fear. There is only one way to overcome fear, and that's the antidote of courage. What is courage that is so strong that it can overcome fear? The dictionary says that courage is a quality of the mind or spirit that enables a person to face difficulty, danger, pain, real or imagined, without fear. In a word, bravery. You know, I'm not so sure that definition helps me a whole lot. So maybe the best way to define courage is to give examples of it. For instance, a person with the highest expression of courage is known as a hero. Oh, I know. Today we use the word hero as a punchline. Everyone's a hero today. You know, I go down to Robeson County to attend plots very often. I drive by the Smithfield packing plant outside of Tar Heel, North Carolina. And there on the fence surrounding this huge facility are banners that say, "Honk for our heroes." Now, don't get me wrong. I do think these packing plant employees are courageous, but I don't think they are heroes. You know, the old, original, and I think the best definition of a hero is someone who, in facing the absolute certainty of death, does something that saves the lives or improves the well-being of their fellow human beings without regard for his or her own welfare. In the Civil War, Union soldiers assaulting Marye's Heights outside of Fredericksburg realized that after the initial assault had failed, their chances of being killed or severely wounded were over 80%. Yet wave on wave still obeyed the order to charge into certain death in an effort to end slavery. That Shelby Foote called them heroes. He said they were even more courageous than the soldiers who charged in Pickett's charge. During World War II, a young man boarding a train or bus or for boot camp with the certainty of frontline duty had a 40% chance of being killed or badly wounded. Yet he went anyway. A fireman fighting a fire in a high-rise building has a 15% chance of being killed or hurt. The firefighters climbing the stairs of the Twin Towers in New York City on September 9, 2001, did not know that their chances of dying had risen to 99.99%. But I believe that even if they had known those odds, they would have climbed those stairs anyway. Nurses in New York at the height of the COVID outbreak who had underlying physical risk conditions had a 1% chance of dying, but they went in and treated patients anyway, some coming from other regions of the United States to serve. Police officers, truck drivers, grocery store workers, pharmacy, and other health workers, these are examples of courage. You entering this church sanctuary today, I don't know what your chances of catching COVID or dying from it are, but you're showing courage, bravery. So how do we get courage? How does one become courageous? Unfortunately, it's not in our human nature to be so. You cannot train yourself to be courageous. You cannot will yourself to be courageous. Instructors at boot camps cannot tell who will charge forward at the sound of the first shot or who will run for their lives. Often the most confident, self-aware person is the one running, while the most meek and subservient are the ones charging. The reason courage is so difficult to come by is that it's not a quality or spirit that resides in human nature. It comes from God. Only God can replace the spirit of fear in your life with courage. The reason no truly courageous person ever brags about his or her courage is that they know the courage was not their doing, but it came from something beyond their ability. So how can we place ourselves in the position to receive the spirit of courage from God? As our scriptures today show, there are two things that we need to do to place ourselves in the hand of God and allow Him to replace fear with courage. First, we need to trust Him completely. We need to put ourselves into His hands, to supplant our will with His. God told Elijah to come out of the cave and listen. Elijah trusted God and came out of that hiding place. Remember, he's afraid of what God would do. Jesus told Peter to come out of the boat. Peter trusted Christ and stepped out on the water. Joseph, despite the dismal outlook of his future as a slave, put away his arrogant, self-centered past and put his trust in God. We must do the same. We must trust God with our needs, our health, our financial well-being, our future, and yes, we must trust Him with our life. We must place ourselves in His hand and supplant our self-centeredness with His will. So how do we do that? We do that by separating ourselves from the world and placing ourselves in God's presence. By removing the distractions from our life and focusing on Him, in a practical way, we do that by going to church and worshiping Him. I know what everybody is saying. I hear it all the time. You could do church online. You don't have to go to church to worship God. You can worship God anywhere. After all, He's not confined to this church. He's everywhere. I even saw a blog here just a couple days ago from a pastor that stated that all COVID-19 did was accelerate the demise of physical churches, and that we need to find new models of church. Church online, if you will, or church on TV, if you will. And it's true. God is everywhere. You can worship God anywhere and anytime. And of course you should. But the real question isn't where God is. The real question is where you are. Are you trying to give Him a minute of your time amidst the distraction of a phone, the blare of TV, the distractions of everyday life, or the comforts of an easy chair with a cup of coffee close by? And then you expect that to signify your willingness to put your will aside for His? Are you really making your relationship with God the focus of your life? Are you setting yourself aside to follow God's commands? When you step through the doors into this sanctuary, you signify that God is the first and foremost thing in your life, and you're placing all your focus on Him. After all, God loved you so much that He sent His only Son into your dark, hopeless, hateful world, knowing that there was 100% chance He would be humiliated, beaten, and crucified. All so that God could save you from your sin and bring you to salvation. Can we not at least give God 1 hour of our time in His house? And we wonder why with the churches closed, that fear has engulfed our world. Little wonder. You know, one of the reasons I think we don't see more in people in church is that we have a mistaken notion of what gathering in church is for. We think we gather to receive comfort or to hear inspirational music or a wonderful sermon, which, by the way, you're not hearing today. But all of those things, we think we gather to learn more about God from the Bible or to gain support from your fellow church members. And yes, these are all the benefits of church attendance, but we could still gain these benefits online or in small house churches. No, that's not why we come. Real Christians do not come to church for themselves. They come for God and for the mission He has set before us. That's why we're here. We come into this building for two purposes. First, we attend church, a physical church, to worship. We worship God. We make praising Him a priority for this time and in this space. The Bible says that when 2 or more are gathered to worship God, God's presence is magnified. We place ourselves in His presence. Our fears are replaced by His peace. We see Him. We feel Him. We hear him clearly, something that cannot happen when we are distracted by the world. Trusting God completely means something more than easy words. It means physically separating yourself from the world and coming into his presence with an open and eager heart. The second purpose we have for attending a physical church is that it helps us fulfill the great commission that we are all called to do, and that is to make disciples of all the world. You say, well, I can do that by telling people about Christ, or I could do that by living a good and godly life. And of course, you're right. You should be telling others about Christ and living a good life. But let's face it, words are cheap, particularly in this day of lies and falsehoods. Words are cheap. People may consider your words, but what they are really looking at is, does your life reflect what you say? If Christ is so important, why are you not spending time in God's house? Likewise, even atheists can lead good lives that reflect God's glory, but they cannot bring others to lead that same life because they do not know God and do not spend time in God's house. Pastor Valerie mentioned this last week. The number one question Pastor has received these past months as church has closed and then reopened is, how many were there in church today? All pastors are getting the same question. Mega church pastors, small church, all are getting the same question. How many are in church today? People are interested in how many Christians really believe in God, really trust in God, really make God a priority in their lives. Sadly, the answer to this question is very few. Every single church across this land has very few. We're not the exception. We're the rule. What COVID-19 has done is accelerate the dropping of the mask we wear, and I'm not talking about these paper masks, these things here. I'm talking about the mask of persona that we put on. All it's done is accelerating a drop in the mask we wear and expose us for who we really are, a people committed to ourselves and not to God. And so the world takes away the meaning. Well, I guess God didn't mean that much to them after all. And if God doesn't mean that much to the people who call themselves Christian, then why should we be his disciple? Now, I know what you're saying. I will be accused of calling people to come to church to put themselves at risk for catching COVID-19, becoming sick, and even dying. So let me be clear here. Your decision to come to church should not be based on what President Trump says. He's not your God. Should not be based on what Governor Cooper says. He is not your God. Should not be based on what the county commissioners say, or the mayor, or the bishop, nor the administrative council, nor the scientists, nor anyone else, and not even me. We are not God. Your decision to attend church should be based on what God has to say to you. Now, if you're having trouble amidst the storms of life, the falsehoods of the media and the distractions of the world, hearing what God has to say to you today, here's a little guideline. If your head is saying to you, I miss church, I miss the presence of God in church, I really want to go to church today, but a wee, small voice in your heart is saying, yes, but you have a bad health condition, there's good chance that you will die. If that wee voice in your heart is telling you that, you should stay home. Now, David and Ann Higginbotham, Derek, I'm talking to you guys, by the way, up there. Stay home. God has a different plan. He's got a different way for you to serve him. He's talking to you. Stay home. But now if your head is saying, everyone says this is a serious disease and I might get sick, perhaps I should stay home today. I worry about my kids. I can see it online. But in your heart, there's a wee, small voice nagging at you, saying, you really should be in church today. Then you need to come to church. God is knocking on your door. Please open it. There's one other thing we need to place ourselves in the pathway of courage, and that is we must wait. We must wait for God's action that gives us courage. Why must we wait? In Romans chapter 5, it says that faith produces perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. I think it's the same with courage. We must change our character in order to receive courage. We have to lay down who we are, our biases, our need to do it ourselves. We have to totally trust God. Elijah waited. He wanted God to be in that wind. He wanted God to sweep across the plain and crack rocks and show those evil people who God really was. He wanted them to be convicted so that they could turn their hearts back to God. He wanted God to be in that wind, but he wasn't. Elijah wanted him to be in the earthquake. He wanted him to shake those people up, to get them to realize the truth, that these false idols and false practices were unholy. They were leading to their destruction. He wanted them to see the truth. He wanted it to be in that earthquake, but it wasn't. He wanted God to be in the fire, to burn those sinners into everlasting damnation. But God was not in the fire. Elijah had to get rid of his anger, his expectations, his disappointment before he could work for God. Likewise, the disciples had to wait as the storm and waves engulfed them. They had to face their weakness and their imaginary fears and realize their focus was not on Christ. They had to hear with new ears, walk where others dare not trod. Joseph had to wait to purge himself in the fire of slavery and prison from the very arrogance and self-centered that had been his nature and learn to trust God. We have come today to wait. We're waiting here. We're changing our character into trust and obedience so we can do what God asks us to do. If we put our trust in God and wait, we can be assured that in changing of our human nature into God's nature, we will find courage, hope, and direction that we really seek for our lives. The best words in the Bible, as in our lives, are always those that show God's responses to our needs. For Elijah, God came in a gentle whisper, saying, "Come out of the cave. Go back the way you came. I have a plan for you and the people of Israel." And so Elijah took courage and he went back. And it says that 7,000 Israelites were saved who had not bowed their knees to Baal. And those 7,000 formed the foundation for a new nation. They formed the foundation of a new people who trusted God, and from them came the Savior of the world. In essence, Elijah just didn't save 7,000, he saved the world for God by listening to God. God calmed the disciples' fears by saying, "Take courage, don't be afraid, it is I." And then he gave Peter the courage to forget the wind and the waves and walk on water. Only when Peter took his eyes off of Jesus did he find himself sinking. Peter would long remember the courage that Jesus gave him that night. He would need it to stand against an antagonistic world to become the rock upon which God's church would be founded. Joseph heard God's voice in the Pharaoh's dream and found courage and grace to save his fathers and brothers from famine and death. God will speak in your life if you but come into his presence and wait. During the fighting in Vietnam, a young lieutenant, along with his platoon of soldiers, was dropped by helicopter into a clearing at the base of a ridge with the objective of clearing that ridge of the enemy. As the platoon advanced across the grassy clearing, they immediately were confronted by a well-entrenched squad of North Vietnamese. In the hail of machine gun bullets, mortar and artillery rounds, the platoon hit the ground and began frantically searching for any cover they could find. As the lieutenant looked to his left, he saw his radio man hit and killed. As he looked to his right, he saw explosions, killing his soldiers. He dug frantically into the ground in his fear as bullets peppered around him. He closed his eyes and said, "Jesus, help me." All of a sudden, his mind went blank. The noise of the battle faded from his ears, And as silence engulfed him, he heard a small, wee voice. And it said, "Get up, get up." And so he did. He got up and he charged the enemy, expecting at any time to feel the whack of a bullet entering flesh and bone. He thought he was the only one, but all of a sudden, off to the right and to the left, he saw the figures of men running beside him. As if on one command, the platoon had risen and in their courage had charged the enemy position. They took that position and they took the ridge beyond. Are you hiding in your house in fear of sickness and death? God says, "Come, I have a job for you." Are you facing the wind and waves of losing a job or troubles of your work or difficulty in your financial relationships? Jesus is saying, take courage, come out of the boat, face the storm. Are you clawing the ground amidst the shouting, the riots, the looting, the overheated rhetoric of news, the uncertainty of your future? God says, get up, move forward, advance on the hills in your life. Put your trust in the one who is trustworthy. Let him take your fears and install a new courage to face the challenges of life. The world today needs Christ. Riots and looting and violence have become daily activities in America. Suicides are up 150%. Murder rates have risen, doubled, quadrupled in every city, not just across this country, but across the world. Even in Edenton, we see young children being murdered. In Romans 10, verses 13 through 15, Paul, in talking about salvation, says that all who call upon the Lord will be saved. And then he goes on. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Now more than ever in the history of mankind, the world needs good news. And now more than any time in the history of the church, we have the opportunity to bring good news to the world. You say, what? In this time, we have more opportunity than any time in Christian history to bring good news to the world. How is that? How can I bring good news to the world? You can bring good news with one simple act of courage. By simply coming to church, you can change the world. Imagine if today these pews were filled, the Family Life Overflow was filled. Imagine if every church in this country was filled with people seeking God's presence. Imagine the world where churches are filled seeking God's presence. What a news story that would be. It would be on every channel. It would be on every paper. It would be on every talk show. You say, you can't do that. We can't do that. The media would crucify us. The governor would shut us down. People would accuse us of being heartless and uncaring. We would be mocked for being stupid and thinking that God could save us from this virus. It is for these very reasons that we know this is the right thing to do. In the history of Christianity, these have always been the accusations against Christians. Under the Roman Emperor Trajan, Christianity was outlawed. Christians were deemed enemies of the empire. Those meeting in churches were rounded up, imprisoned, and many of them were taken to public venues such as the Colosseum in Rome, where they were slaughtered by wild animals and other such amusements to the crowd. People laughed and mocked. Where is your Jesus now? Calling him to save you. How stupid of you to put your family and friends in danger by clinging to Christ. Yet these very same people who stood there and mocked on their way home to their dark, hopeless, hate-filled lives, they marveled at the courage, peace, and faith of those Christians. And in marveling began to seek that same peace and faith. Eventually, those very people came to underground churches and meeting places seeking the Lord. The church grew even in the face of persecution and death, and the world was changed. We can change the world today just as they changed their world then. by making a commitment to Christ, trusting in him, and taking courage to proclaim his name. Does that mean that by coming into this house of worship, God will protect us from this disease and the violent world around us? No. These doors will not stop COVID-19, nor will they stop bullets and violence, as evidenced by the shootings in South Carolina and Texas. But in truth, we really only have two choices. We can remain in our cave, or in that storm-tossed boat, or we can cling to a bullet-scarred ground, waiting for our fears to overwhelm us, waiting to die a lonely, meaningless death. Or we can take courage, get up, come out of our cave, step out of the boat. Oh yeah, we might sink. Sickness might find us. A bullet might even hit bone and flesh. But in that moment of glory, we can take heart in having changed the course of humankind in bringing back peace and abolishing fear. Only you can choose the course you will take. But as Joshua said in his farewell address to the Israelites, but if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves who you will serve. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Yea, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.